This is BTV World. I am Syed Shabahat and you're watching Fault Lines. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan speaking a while ago with Fareed Zikaria, a famous news anchor of CNN, has given a remarkable interview. He touched upon many areas of conflict in subcontinent and around. In the beginning, he spoke about the Taliban's government that he believes will have to be accepted as there is no alternate available elsewhere for stabilizing Afghanistan. He also believes, and he stated in his interview, that Taliban need to be incentivized, otherwise Afghanistan will never settle down. In his interview, he also said that when it comes to the issue of Xinjiang, it has been propagated a lot, whereas the similar human right or even worse human right violation in India have been ignored by the international community. When Fareed Zikaria asked him for the second time if he has a reservation on the dealing of issues of Muslims in China, he said, "I will not go with the narrative of Western media. I would rather see the briefing given by Pakistan's ambassador in China, who has been in Xinjiang and has reported that things are not as bad as reported by the Western media." Adding to it, Imran Khan also said that the Cold War will just bring more problem for the people in the world, and there should not be hostility between the superpowers so that the world can enjoy the dividends of peace. Since most of his talk was about Afghanistan's issue, we have today invited a robust panel of guests to speak about Afghanistan and the prospects of stability and peace in Afghanistan. My first guest is Harun Rahimi. Harun is Assistant Professor of Law of American University of Afghanistan. He's joining me on Skype. Harun, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
I was just going through an article that you have recently written about Afghanistan and the exodus of refugees. And you have mentioned that there are many people in Afghanistan who are quite afraid of the fact that the bordering countries or the neighboring countries are not going to allow them in. And this is a major reason why refugees are not going to go out, rather going to stay in. Tell us more about the refugees crisis that you have recently written on.
So Afghanistan has always had a very large refugee population, as you know, since Pakistan has hosted a large portion of that population. But the events of August 15 exacerbated an already difficult refugee situation in the country, as millions literally are seeking to leave Afghanistan for a combination of reasons, some economic, some are concerned about their rights, some are concerned about reprisal and revenge killings by the Taliban or other actors who go unchecked inside the country. The recent reports suggest that over the past 4 months only, 1 million Afghans have left their country. And as you know, given the geography of Afghanistan and given the existing movement paths, many of those people, a large portion of those, will go through Pakistan or stay inside the Pakistan territory. Given that historically the border area has been disputed, there have been more or less different level of restrictions on movement, but generally movement has taken place. Iran is a somewhat different scenario, but it's still a large portion of people also go through Iran, and then hopefully they seek to go through Turkey and then Europe. This is happening in the context of a pandemic where there is a new wave of Omicron, as you know, ravaging the entire region. Data in Afghanistan limited, but we know that because of this high level of movement, the virus has infected a large portion of Afghan population. And countries like Iran and Pakistan are concerned about what this movement means for their own efforts to control the pandemic. Also, you have to realize that this region is dealing with a lot more than just COVID. There are other diseases that are often eradicated in other places, which are still active in this region. Polio is an example of a disease that is often eradicated in other places, but in Afghanistan-Pakistan border, there still exist. So there is multiple layers of crisis that is taking place and is having broad ramifications for Afghans wanting to leave, countries who may have to host them, or maybe the transit route for them to other countries through formal evacuation or smuggling grounds.
Harun, uh, it's quite well explained, and I understand, as you have already elaborated the same in your article. But there is one thing that is very important. As Prime Minister Imran Khan also said during his interview with Fareed Zikria a while ago, the economic crisis of Afghanistan has now become evidently the most difficult thing to deal with. It's a crisis that we don't see a light of hope on, because recently President Biden has also announced that this money will not be unfrozen again. I'll come to his solution later, but how is the life of an average Afghan today in absence of a formal banking channel or a formal economy being in place?
I mean, Afghanistan economy was very much dependent on foreign aid. 70% of the public spending and most of the government budget was coming from outside. The amount of foreign aid made up most of the country's GDP, was more than half of the GDP, the legal economy. We don't know of the illegal economy. So on August 15, when the sanctions meant for the Taliban became effective over the entire country, and suddenly the facet was closed and no more funds were allowed to come inside the country, Afghanistan lost 30% of its GDP. And a country that was already heavily dependent on aid to survive, like for its basic needs for health, food, suddenly lost all means of satisfying those needs. There were some measures taken there have been some measures taken since then to allow for some humanitarian aid to continue. But those measures have been, although welcome, they have been insufficient. And there's no way they can be sufficient, because, as you pointed out, the question is whether Afghanistan is going to have an economy or not. In the meantime, obviously, aid is the only solution when we need aid for people to survive. But in medium term, the question is whether Afghanistan can have an economy or not. And that question comes down to, well, how the sanctions is going to play out, whether Afghanistan will be able to resume banking services, whether Afghanistan Central Bank would be able to continue to do monetary policies. And the signs in those areas, as you pointed out, the latest one being the President Biden's executive order, are very, very grim. And I'm very struggling to see a little bit of hope in Afghanistan finding its way to a new economy. It is going to be a smaller economy. It's going to be a struggling economy. Afghanistan has always been a poor country, but it has to have a functioning economy. I mean, that is still an existential question. A country cannot remain dependent on aid forever just because the scale of the crisis is such that no amount of aid would be enough. It's impossible to feed 40 million people on aid alone.
I'll come back to you, Harun, on this again. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm now joined by Michael Kugelman from the Wilson Center, Washington, D.C. He's Senior Associate for South Asia. Michael, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good to be here with you.
Michael, we're talking about the economic problems of Afghanistan. And certainly ever since the United States has left Afghanistan, there is a great shift in attitude, in diplomacy, and the concerns that the United States once had for the poor people of Afghanistan. Recently, President Biden has also announced that the money frozen will not be returned back to the Bank of Afghanistan. Half of it would be given to the people who had their claims against Taliban for 9/11, and half of the money will be given to the humanitarian assistance. In terms of when we talk about humanitarian assistance, certainly it's not going to the banking channels. What's your thoughts on it?
Well, yeah, it really is very unfortunate. And this executive order from the administration, I think, is just terrible, because it is taking money that is Afghan money, not exclusively Taliban government money, but Afghan money, and using it for other purposes. And I think even the $3.5 billion that the administration says will be used for humanitarian assistance, that's also problematic, because that money, any money for humanitarian assistance, should not be coming from money that is already Afghanistan's money. And also, it's going to take a long time to get those assets being changed into humanitarian assistance. It's going to take some time because of the court process playing out, and Afghanistan doesn't have the luxury of time. And my broader sense is that the Biden administration, while it says publicly that it remains committed to helping address the humanitarian crisis, I think that increasingly the administration is moving on. It has Afghanistan in its rearview mirror. It's focused on other issues, and I think that means that other countries, as well as the UN and agencies like that, will need to take a much bigger role in trying to avert a economic disaster in Afghanistan.
But Michael, in absence of any economic channel, in absence of any banking channel, and in absence of a government that is recognized, how would Afghanistan go forward? I mean, is there any solution that anyone in the power corridors of United States has for Afghanistan, a viable solution that is applicable with the ground realities of Afghanistan?
And one of the problems is that there's not a consensus within the U.S. government about the best path forward in Afghanistan. There is consensus around the need to mobilize and provide humanitarian assistance. But beyond that, in terms of how to address the broader economic crisis, as reflected in the banking crisis and a lack of liquidity in the country, there's not any consensus, quite frankly, on that. And I also think that there's a bandwidth issue, that the administration is just focused on so many other things right now, of course, particularly the Ukraine crisis at the moment. And I think that that's made it all the more difficult for there to be some type of plan developed. And again, Afghanistan does not have the luxury of time. As you know, it can't wait around while the U.S. tries to muster some type of plan. I mean, there is still, as I understand it, about $2 billion left in the Afghan central bank assets that were not in the U.S. and were not included in this executive order, which involved the $7 billion of the $9 billion total dollars of Afghan central bank assets. So I think Europe hosts the remaining $2 billion. I hope that something can be done about those frozen funds in the hopes that those can be brought back into the country to inject some liquidity. But that's only a drop in the bucket. So much more needs to be done. So, unfortunately, my simple answer to your important question is that no, the U.S. does not have any type of plan. There's not enough consensus, and quite frankly, there's not enough bandwidth either at the moment, which is really quite unfortunate.
Coming back to you, Harun, do you agree that there is a rising resentment against United States in Afghanistan now, as the people see that most of their ills, which Googleman also agreed, are because of this attitude of United States, which is not helping the economy and is not allowing Afghan government to settle down as well?
I mean, the U.S. has earned a lot of goodwill with large portion of Afghan population over the past 20 years. It has also made a lot of enemies in Afghanistan during the war on terror and then the counterinsurgency war, and because of the actions of the previous Afghan government, which was supported by the United States. But it's still a large portion of the Afghans had very much good attitudes towards the United States. But the decisions taken towards the end, the approach taken to withdrawal, and now the hard kind of positions taken with regard to efforts needed to ease ease the restrictions on the Afghan economy, are creating a lot of frustration, are creating a lot of feeling of betrayal amongst the Afghans. And they are basically asking themselves whether U.S. actually cared about the plight of Afghans, including Afghan women, who as a vulnerable group are going to be the first to suffer from an complete economic collapse. As you know, in our region, when things get bad, the most vulnerable often suffer the most, and women are the most vulnerable group. Girls' education is not a top priority for a family that is trying to survive. The equality, the access to basic services for women would not be the top priority for a family that is struggling to put food on the table. We already hear reports of early marriages, people resorting to selling their babies sometimes, extreme examples, and those often are girls. So it kind of raises the question in the minds of many Afghans: was this all for? What was it for? If it was for the well-being of ordinary Afghans, why is now suddenly U.S. is not adopting policies that would help the ordinary Afghan, and is actually at times taking policies that is hurting the ordinary Afghan? I mean, ordinary Afghans did not support the Taliban. They were victims of the Taliban. I mean, Taliban have a narrow base of support in the country, but an ordinary person in Afghanistan often just wants to live their lives, as most people do everywhere. And they just want to be able to live with dignity and have a way to earn their own livings and live in their own country. That's what most people everywhere want. But what the U.S. is doing in reacting to the Taliban takeover, which Taliban did, I believe, made their own choices to take over militarily and caused some of the chain reactions that led us here, and they bear responsibility for that. But their U.S. reaction to those decisions is to punish, is to adopt policies as a result of which the ordinary Afghans are suffering. And the Taliban overall do not seem to be severely damaged by these policies relative to ordinary Afghans. So to answer your questions, absolutely. I mean, there are people who are asking those questions about the past 20 years, and there are people who are getting more frustrated, feeling more betrayed, and even more angry. So the U.S. basically destroying what it built in terms of goodwill in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, Harun, for being a guest in my program. Coming back to you, Michael Kugelman, you just heard what the sentiment is there in Afghanistan. I recently interviewed Rauf Hassan, who is a special assistant to Prime Minister of Pakistan on information and broadcasting. I asked him a question. Listen to his response before I take your comments on that. Percent of the people are today making less than $2 a day. Afghanistan is facing one of the worst famines of its history, and there are no banking channel operational in the country.
So, who has done it? Who is holding on to Afghan assets? $9.5 billion. Americans. Who has frozen the banking channels? Americans. Not the European community, not the United Nations, not the international donor organizations.
But
Americans, basically. I mean, it's an inhuman conduct on the part of. I'm sorry, I'm constrained to say this. I don't know who's going to be happy, who's not going. It is absolutely downright inhuman conduct on the part of Americans. They want to see. Let me tell you. Let me just quote you, and I've got to tell. Let me quote you a couple of things. It's very important, and it is not me. It is what the United Nations is saying. Recently, Telegraph conducted a poll, a study. And in an open letter, that the agencies, international agencies, have sent to United Nations, they've said that sanctions would kill more Afghans than the war has done.
Michael Kugelman, he said sanctions will kill more Afghans than the war did. Now, to add into it, I have a very different perspective for you. You can see the problems that Pakistan's economy is facing. Iran, the other neighboring state, is also under sanctions. Central Asian Republic, you see what is happening there. There are revolts, there are economic problems everywhere. What do you believe will happen as an outcome of this entire saga if this does not end here? I mean, the economic problem is if it's not solved, and if a government leadership is not recognized, as the Prime Minister also said, what do you believe will happen in this region?
Yeah, I very much worry about the spillover effects, including, especially in bordering countries like Pakistan, if the current situation continues to get worse, which I imagine it will. And as Imran Khan mentioned in his interview on CNN earlier, the issue of refugees will be clearly a major challenge. With more and more people having no income, no jobs, increasingly desperate, I think we will see increased refugee flows. The fact that the war has ended in Afghanistan means that you're going to have less refugees triggered by conflict, but you're going to have so many triggered by economic failure. So that's clearly going to be a consequence right there, which poses various challenges. And I think broadly speaking, if you have an economic collapse in Afghanistan, that could usher in, so much lawlessness and chaos and more violence, and that could have impacts across the border as well, including such as cross-border terrorism, that type of thing. So absolutely, I think that the bordering countries, Pakistan and Iran and the Central Asian states, have the most to lose, other than Afghanistan, of course, if this economic disaster continues to grow. And this is why I really hope that the world can somehow develop some type of consensus, which does not exist right now, in terms of how to move forward. And I emphasize what I said before, that we cannot expect the U.S. to be the country to do this, even though the U.S. is at fault, because indeed it had placed sanctions on the Taliban government, and it has made things worse with the frozen assets, and this recent decision will make things even worse still. But I think we need to look to other countries. I would be great to see the regional players, Pakistan and others, become more engaged. The problem is so great. The scale of the challenge in Afghanistan is so great that it's going to be difficult, and there are no immediate term solutions at a moment when you do need immediate action, which is going to make things all the more difficult. But indeed, the spillover effects to the bordering countries of Afghanistan are very much, these are clear and present dangers and very, very real and certainly are worth acknowledging, particularly by those in the West and the U.S. that would not be impacted by these spillover effects for geographic reasons. I think it's important that countries far beyond Afghanistan acknowledge that the countries very close to Afghanistan will bear the brunt of a worsening economic crisis in Afghanistan.
And Michael, you're quite aware of the fact that Afghan war was started on the notion of fighting against terrorism, but United States has left an active terrorist organization that has been identified as the new enemy in the region, as IS Khorasan. So how they are going to fight against IS Khorasan, or is there any will in U.S. administration to fight against IS Khorasan if Taliban's are not partners?
Right, yeah. I mean, the U.S. plan to develop this counterterrorism capacity from outside of Afghanistan, it is very much focused on ISK and not on any other terror group in Afghanistan, other than perhaps Al-Qaeda. And I think the fact that you had that horrific ISK attack outside the Kabul airport towards the end of the withdrawal, which killed dozens of people, including 13 American service persons, that was, I think, for political reasons, made it impossible for the Biden administration to move away from any plan to develop the capacity to monitor and strike ISK in Afghanistan. But it's going to be very difficult to do that because at this point, the U.S. is forced to depend on existing U.S. military assets and facilities in the Middle East and the Gulf region, and that's very far away. It's very difficult to have efficient counterterrorism capacity if you have to depend on assets and springboards so far away from the target area, being Afghanistan. My sense is that the U.S. has not been successful in getting any type of agreement from countries bordering Afghanistan about new intelligence sharing arrangements or basing arrangements. So that will make things even more difficult for the U.S. And quite frankly, I would argue that this is not a priority for the U.S. government right now to the extent that it's focused on Afghanistan. It's focused on the issue of the humanitarian crisis and also on the issue of evacuations, which has not been going well either. The counterterrorism capacity plan is something that I think the administration will want to work on further down the road, especially if it is able to get more assistance from the region. But at this point, I don't think that assistance is there. And ISK is indeed a threat. We talk about the Pakistani Taliban, but ISK is a threat as well. It has staged attacks in Pakistan, and it has been strengthened in its own ways because of what's played out in Afghanistan in recent months.
Not only that, Michael, but also the weapon that NATO has left has fallen in the wrong hands and has started being used against Pakistan's armed forces in various militant operations. But just to get back to your point that you mentioned, so what I understand out of it is that United States approach or United States solution toward any problem of militancy is still the use of brute kinetic force and nothing beyond that. Is this what can I understand? Because we have seen kinetic actions not working, not yielding results in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, and even the recent past in Afghanistan. It didn't work for 20 years.
Yes, no, this is true. And I think it's not only the U.S. that thinks it's way many countries do. But, one thing I like to say frequently is that it's fairly easy to kill terrorists, but it's much more difficult to kill the ideologies that sustain them. And so the U.S. certainly has tried to use counter-extremism policies, de-radicalization policies, but that's very difficult to do in Afghanistan when you have no assets on the ground, there's no U.S. personnel, and the U.S. embassy is not operating in Afghanistan. It doesn't recognize the government in Afghanistan. So that leaves it with very few options other than, trying to surveil, monitor ISK threats in Afghanistan and trying to develop the capacity to strike those ISK targets in Afghanistan if it's able to do so. But yes, you're right. The U.S. approach is very limited and narrow in focus, restricted simply to killing the bad guys, which is really the only option that the U.S. has vis-a-vis the ISK threat in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, Michael Kugelman, for being a guest in my program. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Michael Kugelman, and what he said was quite revealing. He said he agrees to us on the fact that United States apparently does not have a plan on Mission Afghanistan as of now. He also agreed with us on the fact that without mainstreaming the economy of the country, Afghanistan cannot be settled, cannot be made peaceful. And in the end, he also agreed with us on the fact that the brute use of kinetic force that United States has been trying historically on all the avenues has not worked anywhere and is not likely to work even in Afghanistan when it comes to ISK. We'll take a break and we'll join you back with the next segment of the program. Stay with us. Welcome back. Prime Minister Imran Khan, in his interview today with Fareed Zikaria on CNN, responded to a question which was asked regarding the handling of issue of Xinjiang Muslims by the Chinese authorities. He said the world has dual standards and world have a notion of selective justice. He categorically mentioned it that while there is too much drum beating on the Chinese issues of Muslims, there is very little attention paid to 100,000 people killed in the Indian occupied Kashmir. Prime Minister Imran Khan, when he had taken the oath rather slightly earlier than that, when he made his success speech from his residence after winning the elections, he had made a promise to the people of Kashmir, and the promise was that Imran Khan will be an ambassador of the cause of Kashmir and will do the diplomacy that on this issue which will be unique, will take it to a new standard. And he fulfilled this promise to a great extent. Not only he took the issue of Kashmir in an extraordinary manner in UNGA Assembly, where his speech was boycotted by the Indians, but rest of the world had to listen to him. But again, he didn't miss the opportunity of utilizing this interview, and he made it clear that when on the issue of Kashmir, there is a humanitarian crisis being widely ignored. To speak further on this issue, I'm joined by Awais bin Wasi. He is a researcher at Institute of Policy Studies and is going to join me on Skype. Awais, I welcome you to my program.
Thank you so much.
And we are going to discuss the Prime Minister's speech, Prime Minister's interview with Fareed Zikaria, where he categorically spoke about the issue of Kashmir, once again reminded the Western media that they are doing an information blackout of this issue of Kashmir. Your take on it, sir?
This issue of Jammu and Kashmir, that is not an internal issue of India, which India claims. It is an internationally recognized dispute that is on the agenda of United Nations Security Council. And quite recently, that issue has been taken up. And there are 18 resolutions adopted by the United Nations. There are several reports of human rights organizations. There are several relevant clauses of international humanitarian law. There are several clauses of Geneva Convention which are applicable to Jammu and Kashmir. So this issue should be taken in that international spirit. But this is very unfortunate that global intelligentsia and the governments, particularly the Western governments, they are not taking notice of the gravity of the situation which is taking place in an area which is surrounded by three nuclear powers, India, Pakistan, and China. So although in the global intelligentsia, some of the voices that we do hear, quite recently, we heard the opinion of Noam Chomsky, and previously within India, we also heard Arundhati Roy and Swaminathan and Ajit Sahi, and there are some other people, senior voices that we also hear. But the criminal silence on the part of the government and on the part of the organizations. This is a matter of concern, and I think that if we come across some statements from these quarters, that is not sufficient. I think sanctions should be imposed as it happens in other parts of the world. The Kashmiris are not, children of lesser God. They, in animal form, George Orwell said that some people are equal and some are more equal. So that dual standard and that injustice practices, that is not going to contribute in maintaining peace and harmony in South Asia and in the world. I think that must be taken very carefully till it gets too late.
Wes, we are living in the times, in very challenging times, let me rephrase. And the media has a great role in shaping the perceptions of the people. Do you believe that the Indian media or this Bollywood propaganda industry that has its hands on the entire globe and is having a very imperative role in opinion making is a major reason why Kashmir's agenda has not been driven and why the minds of common people have not been made? And I will link this with a point of EU disinformation laboratories findings, where it was revealed that Indian media is running, or Indian organizations, NGOs are running many fake media outlets to do some false propaganda on the issue of Kashmir.
Exactly. The role of mainstream India, fortunately, is very negative. That is motivated by the spirit of jingoism, and what it portrays, what it shows, and what it hides with regard to Kashmir. I think that media, that mainstream media, is not causing any good to maintain peace and harmony within India and in the region as well. However, the importance of generating discourse, generating information, generating literature on Kashmir, that is very important. Quite recently, in another program in the PTV world, I was talking about that we lacked voices, such voices which we see on the conflicts of, for example, in Palestine. Edward Said and Mahmoud Darwish and some other people, they have they were quite prolific in producing that literature for the cause of Palestine. But as far as literature, indigenous literature on Kashmir, that I think needs to be amplified, that needs to be increased, especially the indigenous people, the local people of J&K, youngsters, intelligentsia, academicians, researchers, journalists. They should tell their story. They should tell their story to the world that we are the victims, and if the story is being told by the people of J&K, I think that there will be more buyers, there will be more takers, there will be more acceptance of the global community. And global community will later on, the time will come that global community will push to their respective governments that now the time has come to play the role to resolve this issue of Jammu and Kashmir.
But Avas, I have a more pertinent question towards it. When you say about the citizen voices or the voices of the common people or the literature that you were referring, why is not enough protest coming from within Kashmir on the social media? We have not been able to see a lot of such material coming out where the local people themselves are telling their stories or filming it. Is it because of the internet blockade? Is it still going on? Please apprise us on that as well. Or is it because of the increasing fear of Hindutva in Modi's India that is becoming increasingly intolerant?
Exactly. People are writing in Jammu and Kashmir. They are quite prolific. For example, that in literature, Mirza Waheed has written, Shahnaz Bashir has written, Basharat Peer has written, and before, if you see the poetry of Agha Shahid Ali, so there is a potent voice, representing and reflecting the sentiment of freedom. But unfortunately, the lockdown, the blockade, the communication shutdown that is imposed by the Indian government, that is one of the blockades which does not allow such voices to come to the forefront, and it could reach to the global media. Some of the fictional voices that they could read because they are published by some international publishing houses, but within due to this blockade and due to this communication shutdown, these voices
Thank you
are
very
not
much,
coming out.
Avas. Avas, thank you very much for being guest in my program. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Avas bin Wasi, who was enlightening us with his thoughts. He also told us that because of the increasing fear of Hindutva in Hindustan, Muslims are becoming more conscious. And now I am joined by Lieutenant General retired Khalid Naeem Lodhi. He is the former Defense Secretary and a famous defense analyst. General sir, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. So kind of you.
So we are talking about the recent interview of Prime Minister Imran Khan. There was a question being asked to him with regards to the human rights violation that Western media always talks about. And in response, Prime Minister categorically said that world is operating on dual standards. Western media is propagating a false propaganda, whereas the reality on ground in Kashmir is not being seen. He has before, when he was, in UNGA in his speech, he also made it clear in there that because of the increasing business interest with India, United States and rest of the world is not taking a hard stance on the issue of Kashmir. Your thoughts on that, sir?
Thank you very much. I think we should be proud that our Prime Minister was very forthright and candid at such a forum, which is watched and listened by the entire world. The question was very pointed by Fareed Zakaria. He wanted to know his reaction, whatever allegations are being made against China for the treatment of Muslims in Xinjiang region. I think Prime Minister came out quite openly and close to the fact that one, if two sides are saying different things, the West is saying something different, the Chinese are saying something different. So what option do we have? So he said we had the option of actually checking up on ground, and he said we asked our ambassador to visit on ground and tell us the facts. And according to our Prime Minister, whatever he was briefed by our ambassador in China, that was far, far away from what allegations were being made by the West. So, and secondly, I think he immediately raised a very valid point that whereas much graver human rights violations are going on in Indian illegally occupied Kashmir, and nobody cares about that. I think he made the questioner quite speechless. Zakaria had nothing to say once he said that whatever is going on in Kashmir, there's no comparison. If we look at the violence, the level of violence, the atrocities being perpetrated over there, and the West and Americans, they have not been speaking about it. Of course, now the media is opening up, and now we have, as brother was saying, many articles are coming up. So I would say that Prime Minister was candid, Prime Minister was forthright, Prime Minister was factually correct.
Lodhi sir, also, as we are seeing this is coming on the media over and over that not only Muslims but all the minorities in Modi's India are now getting oppressed by the intolerant regime of Hindutva. And this tide is rising. It's not only Muslims, it's the Christians, it's the Sikhs, and social media actually is taking these stories to the entire world. What can be an outcome if this does not stop here? Because India is a big country and has a huge number of people living in the country who are not Hindu by their religion.
I think Prime Minister also alluded to that while a question was being asked about Pak-India relations. And he said that Pakistan, and according to, of course, he said that he was the first one after he got elected, to extend his hand of friendship towards India and asking them that you come one step and we go towards you two steps. But then he said that the government over there has been overtaken by Hindutva, thinking, and they are doing so much of harm to themselves. And he then indicated the things which you are talking about, the whatever they are doing within minorities, and not only Muslims, also Christians and Sikhs and Dalits and everybody, all the minorities. And he was of the opinion that India is doing no good to themselves and is going to harm them. And I think he was right, and I would also support his thinking. that whatever India is doing today in the form of extremist attitude towards minorities and especially towards Muslims, I think is ultimately going to hurt them. And although there are certain voices propping up from the Indian polity itself, the civilized part of India, many people who think that whatever Modi government is doing is wrong, but I think they are quite weak, and the extremists are having a heyday in India. The way we see they behave with the Muslims and with all others. So I think what can happen is, one, that the minorities will have no trust in the future, governments of India, and especially if BJP continues, and they would like to, carve out separate homelands from within the Indian geography, and I hope the Indian leadership understand that. So whatever they are doing, in my opinion, is going to harm them, is going to divide them, is going to weaken them.
My last question in the program, and I'll need your quick take on that, Lodi Saab, is that without settling the issue of Kashmir, without this problems that the Muslims are facing in India, how fruitful would be a peace talk, or how practical is to have a peace talk with India and to normalize the relationship between the two countries?
Normalization basically depends upon the attitudes of the two sides. And one-sided goodwill will not work. And we have seen this happening, for decades. Pakistan has always been forthcoming and asking Indians to please sit down and talk about Kashmir. And Kashmir is not only a local problem. It has been, it is there on the UN Security Council list, still active, problems of the world which they consider it. So it is still there. And the Kashmiris deserve, after, the persecution for such a long time, they deserve to be treated like humans. And that is what we are asking. The resolution of Kashmir may take some time, but at least if they stop the atrocious attitude towards Kashmiri Muslims and other Muslims, the Indian mainland, the talk can start and we can have some working relationship. But I think without the resolution of issue of Indian occupied Kashmir or Kashmir as a whole, and whatever they are doing with the minorities, without resolving these issues, there would be any effort from the Pakistani side will ultimately be futile, because goodwill cannot go very far, cannot stay for very long unless you have built a trust, and that trust can only be built if they stop what they are doing with the minorities and what they are doing in occupied.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant General Retired Khalid Naeem Lodhi Saab, for being a guest in my program. Ladies and gentlemen, my last guest in the program told us that without enough efforts being done from both the sides, subcontinent cannot become a peaceful region. The peace between Pakistan and India is not possible, is not plausible without settling down the issue of Kashmir according to the commitments that India has so blatantly made in United Nations, and is now not paying any attention toward the right of the people. The international community will also have to come forward and remind India of its promises. We'll join you next week with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.